Hi, everyone. My name is Murray Fulton, and I am a professor of public policy at the Johnson Shyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan. I am pleased to introduce Michael Sykuta. Michael is an economist and associate professor in the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri. Extensively about agricultural contracts, corporate governance, regulation, and big agricultural data. In this interview, Michael will provide an overview of the key issues around agricultural data. If you are interested in more detail on the issues that Michael discusses in this interview, please see his June 2016 article in the International Food and Agribusiness Management Review Journal. The article is titled Big Data in Agriculture: Property Rights, Privacy, and Competition in Ag Data Services. Welcome, Michael. Let's get right into the questions. Tell me, what is big ag data and how does it differ from small ag data?
Well, when we talk big data generally, typically what characterizes big data versus small data is the volume and frequency that the data are collected. We've had data collected in agriculture for years. We've had harvest yield monitors. We've had other applications that have collected data on the farm. Very often that data might be held by the farmer. Very often it might sit on the farmer's computer and never be looked at or analyzed in any serious way. And we wouldn't normally think of that as big data. It's not very frequent. It happens once a year, right, for annual crop production. And it isn't being used a whole lot in most traditional settings. I think where we start thinking about big ag data is when we have larger companies that are agglomerating data from lots of different farmers, so that it's still only annual data, perhaps, but it's across hundreds or thousands of farms, which allows the people who look at the data to draw much larger, more extensive conclusions about the things they would be looking at.
Yeah, very good. So then, given that, why is there so much interest in big ag data? What is at stake?
Well, a few things. Why are people collecting it in the first place? The ag input providers, I think seed manufacturers, even chemical companies, can use that data to help better refine or improve their technology development. So if you think about traditional hybrid production in hybrid crops like corn, where we would try and cross-pollinate, we'd have to grow it out, we'd wait and see how it worked, then we'd see what worked and didn't work, we'd have to hybrid it out again, and go through several of these cycles. If we wanted to see how crops compared on different farms, it would be really difficult. We have test plots where we see small-scale comparisons of different kind of seed and production practices, kind of side by side, but those give us a fairly narrow understanding of what's going on. If we can collect data from thousands of farms at a broadly different set of geographic areas with climates, soil types, and all of these things, we can make really good inferences about how different plant characteristics perform, how different seed characteristics perform, how different planting characteristics perform. And then when we look at the results of those behaviors, we can get a much better idea of what kind of seeds work well in a very particular environment, what kind of seeds don't work so well in a very particular environment. And then that can allow those ag service providers to refine and enhance what some have even called prescriptions, right? Where they offer a prescription on what kind of seed you might want to plant, the density that you might want to plant, what kind of irrigation, whether it's irrigated or not, what kind of chemicals or other things might be used. And it gets very knowledge intensive in terms of how to manage the farm operation. So for the developers of those products, having all of this information is like giving them a giant laboratory worth of information to do kind of scientific studies or statistical studies. Much more than they can do in even their very large growing chambers at their production facilities, right? So from a farmer's perspective, they get the benefit of that knowledge that's gained, right? In some sense, if you can tell me what variety of seeds are likely to have the highest yield at the lowest cost of production for me, that certainly makes my farm better off. And that's really where we've seen the value to farmers in participating in these programs, is they get improved yields, they might get more efficiencies and reduce the cost of production, which increases farm income. The challenge is, and the thing people are worried about are, yeah, you have that data, but what else are you doing with it? Might it be used in some way that might be detrimental to the farmer? If you're creating value, you're creating these new products using my data, what's the benefit for me of letting you use my data to create that value, right? So there's some of these questions that are being asked at the farm level about how these data are being used, whom they're being shared with, what the benefit to the farmer is of those data practices that sometimes aren't very obvious on the surface.
Mm-hmm. So, what you've sketched out very nicely is that this big ag data provides a new way, if you like, of doing business at the level of the input suppliers. Their, if you like, production model can change in terms of how they think about new developments of new varieties and so forth. But it's also then changing the way that production is taking place on the farm. Farmers that are have access to either better information or new products that they can then integrate into their operations. So both of kind of a farm level as well as an aggregate level impact. So you've mentioned a couple of the issues that arise with this move to big ag data. Are there any more issues that we should be thinking about, either from the perspective of farmers or these companies that are producing the seeds and perhaps fertilizers and chemicals, but also the people who are actually providing this service, because often these are somewhat independent from the input suppliers. Are there any other issues that we should be thinking about?
Well, the biggest issue probably is how is this data and the knowledge about the data and the value of the use of the particular practices on the farm being translated into pricing, right? So if I'm getting a prescription of a particular variety of seeds, how do I know that I'm not being recommended to just buy the most expensive seed? How much of the price of the seed am I paying is the value of the extra production that I'm going to get knowing this stuff, and how much of it is the input provider directing me towards something that might be a higher value seed for them to sell. And we see this in consumer data as well, or in consumer data concerns, when we think about companies like Amazon, for instance, where they get such good information about the value of products to individual buyers that they customize pricing to individual buyers. Right? As economists, we talk about this as price discrimination, or kind of first-degree price discrimination even. And there's some concern in the farm community that, well, if you know how much extra value all of this production practice, inputs, choice, and whatnot is creating to my farm, you have the ability to price it. Right. So if I can, if I'm the input provider and I believe that I can increase the value of your operation by so many dollars per hectare or per acre, I'm going to try and capture the value for myself by charging you a fraction of that extra value. That's what's in it for me as the seller of the data and the inputs, is to get some of the benefit that you would be getting from the farm. How much of that gains from trade is split between the farm and the data companies is really the big question mark. We don't know exactly how that's being split. In a competitive market, we would expect that farmers would get a larger share of the gains from trade than in less competitive industries. And that raises questions about, well, then what does all this big data do for competition in the marketplace for service providers and that kind of thing? And how does that, again, kind of come back and affect the farm's prices? So I think that's probably one of the biggest concerns is the input company going to be able to charge me higher prices for products that create more value, both for me, but for the market as well. Right. There are some other concerns about how these data may be used kind of against farmers in some way, in off-farm or non-directly related to production. I think most of those concerns are overblown about how it might affect farm values, how it might affect movements in commodity markets in general. But at the farm level, we certainly have this concern about kind of price discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the bigger level, when we have these large companies that have access to these very large data sets, what does that do for competition in the ag services industries? Do keepers of large sets of data have a competitive advantage over new companies? Do they play a gatekeeper role so that they kind of are able to limit new entry into the industry by licensing use of data? So there are some concerns on that competitive scale as to whether or not these collections of big data in the hands of a small number of ag service providers or ag technology companies, might have long-run negative implications.
I've also heard that there's a concern by some farmers over and above the competition issue, and that about data privacy and security. How big of an issue is that, do you think?
Well, you have to ask the question of what's the potential harm a farmer would suffer if someone gets hold of their data, and what would that look like, right? And it's important. One of the distinctions that I learned early on in this, which I didn't fully appreciate at the time, was a lot of the protections we have around data privacy are specifically for personal data privacy. And while a lot of farmers understand that their farm is personal to them, the data collected in agricultural production type arrangements are commercial data, not personal data. And therefore they're subject to different sets of privacy rules, kind of personal privacy rules about your social security number and all those kinds of things don't apply to your farm data. So if we think about, okay, so what's the risk of that data being shared? Well, what would be the incentive to share it if I've collected that information? What would be my incentive to share it? And that would only be if someone else thought they could use it to create something of value. Well, what would they be able to create of value? Presumably new technologies, new products that would be relevant or of interest to the farmers whose data they're using in developing those products. So in some sense, to the extent that there's a concern that my data get out there somewhere or somehow, it's more likely to be in a way that leads to innovation, leads to new technology development that would create new opportunities for farmers, whether on the input side or the output side, which doesn't seem like a huge risk, right?
Or if I may, it takes you back into the competition issue that you talked about earlier, where you're concerned that that data might be used in some way to extract more of a payment from the farmer.
But then that's true. But if that's kind of between me and my service provider, then that's not so much a data privacy issue, right? Exactly. In the sense that I'm giving them my data to be able to get my prescriptions. They learn from that. They can price more directly to my interests and my value. But there's not really a data privacy issue there in terms of someone else getting hold of my data that I didn't know about or agree to, right?
Right. Good. What about what kind of interest does society have in all of this? What is there at a sort of bigger level? What are some of the promises of big ag data and perhaps some of the threats?
So I think the general benefit to society is if we have more efficient agricultural production, where we can increase the availability of food and or lower the cost of producing the food we have by using more refined production practices, by improving the production technology, that benefits society just in terms of being able to feed the world, right? We've heard a lot about the growing population of the world. By the end of the century, we're going to have to feed close to 11 billion people across the globe. How are we going to do that with less arable land available, with less water available, with fewer workers available? The only way we're going to be able to do that is by finding technology efficiencies and increases in productivity. And these big data practices are one way that we may be able to realize that. So I think from society's perspective, there are a lot of potential benefits from learning from these data and developing better production practices that yield greater amounts of food at lower cost. Right? from society's concerns about risk, again, to the extent society, there's anything that I would see as a societal risk in this sense, it might be the competition argument, right? If 2 or 3 large ag companies get hold of large swaths of this data and they make it difficult for anybody else to access these data, then it kind of creates a monopsony in those big companies, which one might argue would reduce the level of innovation as opposed to grow the level of innovation. Might argue that it increases the cost of production to farmers because that value gets extracted and priced in ways that a small number of large companies might take advantage of. So that would probably be the biggest source of societal concern. Again, it comes down to how real and present of a danger is that relative to the potential benefits of increased production of food across the board.
Excellent. Good. Thank you, Michael. Anything, I think we're just about at the end here. Anything you want to say sort of to recap the argument? Anything you've missed?
I think the only other aspects of this are, there are concerns about how these data might be used outside of kind of the production context. Some have argued that, these data could be used to manipulate commodity markets. Some have argued that these data might be used to strategically target land purchases by those folks who are investing in agricultural real estate as an investment as opposed to wanting to be producers of agriculture. And those are probably some somewhat legitimate concerns. I think the question becomes, how targeted are these data geographically? One of the things we talk about in the privacy stuff, and if you look at the principles of data privacy that the large technology companies have voluntarily adopted, there's language in there about farmers having access to their data, being able to keep their data and kind of retain ownership of their data. But once it gets agglomerated or aggregated and de-identified, then they no longer have any kind of rights of control. But once it's de-identified, then it also can't be used for things like targeting the most productive 1,000 hectares of arable land in Saskatchewan, right? So some of those concerns, I think, these side concerns get a little overblown. And industry has adopted these voluntary practices. It's interesting to me that in the 6 years since my article appeared, not much has changed. Nothing's really changed legislatively that I'm aware of in the United States anyway. Nothing's changed in federal regulation of any significance in terms of how these data are treated and the kind of concerns that are being addressed, which suggests that at least for now, a lot of the problems that we've been worried about haven't given rise to major concerns that would result in policy changes. Mm-hmm. So that's encouraging.
Yeah. And you're right. This is my understanding as well, that that paper that I referred to earlier does actually capture a sort of a series of things that actually are pretty much the same today as they were back then. Good. Michael, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you walking us through these issues around big ag data and giving us an overview of some of the challenges, some of the and some of the risks that are out there. Your review has provided an excellent entry point to, I think, some of the in-depth discussions that we will be having at 2 upcoming events. And let me just say a little bit about those. The first of these events is an online webinar on Friday, February 25th. The second event is a symposium that will be held in person in Kamloops, British Columbia on March 25th. You can also participate in this latter event online. If you would like more information about these events, do a Google search for Big Ag Data Revolution and Big Ag Data Symposium. And I hope to see every one of you at one or both of these events. Thanks for listening.